Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for session 4 of Making African America, Immigration and the Changing Dynamics of Blackness, a virtual symposium. I'm Zita Nunes, Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Maryland. This session is titled Artistic Encounters, Literature, Music, and Art History. The panel addresses the diaspora through the lens of cultural production retentions and offers dynamic examples of the meanings and legacies of migration. The session will explore how cultural productions in literature, music, and art both reflect and contribute to the complexity of encounters between African Americans and Black immigrants during the 20th century. I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists for this afternoon, each of whom will speak for 15 minutes. Their presentations will be followed by a question and answer period. Our first speaker, Silvio Torres-Saillant, is Professor of English and Dean's Professor of Humanities in the College of Arts and Sciences at Syracuse University. He writes on the intellectual history of the Caribbean and the literature of the Caribbean diaspora. Torres-Saillant's research is committed to understanding the enduring impact of the knowledges created by European colonizers of the region in the early modern period and overcoming the sense of difference that lingers from these intellectual frameworks. Our second speaker, Professor Dagmawi Woubshet, who you'll see on your screen, you'll see his photograph on the screen. He is currently in Addis, and the connection is poor, so you'll hear his voice, but you'll see his photograph on the screen. So Dagmawi Woubshet is a Huja Family Presidential Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and author of The Calendar of Loss, Race, Sexuality, and Mourning in the Early Era of AIDS. His next book will examine the later writings of James Baldwin. Woubshet is interested in the intersections of African American, LGBTQ, and African studies, as well as transatlantic studies, post-colonial literature, and comparative race and empire studies. Our third speaker, Jason McGraw, is Associate Professor of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. He is the author of The Work of Recognition, Caribbean, Colombia, and the Post-Emancipation Struggle for Citizenship. And he's currently at work on a book about the international history of Jamaican music. McGraw's teaching and research interests include race and gender in the Americas, the African diaspora, and the Atlantic world. Our final speaker, Mukoma Ngugi, is Associate Professor of English at Cornell University and a scholar of comparative African literature. He is the author of 3 novels and 2 books of poetry. His recent monograph, The Rise of the African Novel, Politics of Language, Identity, and Ownership, examines earlier misreadings of African literature, arguing that early South African literature influenced multiple transnational literatures, including that of the African independence era. So thank you, and Professor Saillant will get us started.
Very much. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by extending a brief word of gratitude to the coordinating team at the University of Maryland, namely Professor Julie Green, co-director of the Center for Global Migration Studies, to the center's assistant director, Katerina Keene, and to Professor Nancy Raquel Mirabal, head of the Latin American Studies program. A gratitude that I extend as well to the counterparts of these colleagues in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. A note of appreciation also to the behind-the-scene IT personnel and overall technical support staff that have enabled us to meet virtually for this important series of presentations and conversations. Henry Louis Gates Jr. recalls in the opening of his Black in Latin America, both the book and the video documentary, that it was not until his sophomore year at Yale University in 1969, when he audited an art history course taught by Professor Harris Thompson, that he came into meaningful awareness of the spread of the African presence in the Western Hemisphere outside of the United States. There is a way in which the Black experience in the non-North American side of the hemisphere has needed to be discovered and rediscovered again by every new generation of African Americans in the United States. The precarious visibility of African-descended people in lands south of the Rio Grande to their counterparts in the United States also renders precarious the visibility of the memory of the Latin American and Caribbean origins of many bona fide African Americans stemming from a history of migration from the south to the north of the hemisphere, dating back to the colonial period. Martin Delaney's 1959 novel, Blake, or The Huts of America, imagines a geography over a century and a half ago, imagined a geography of Black solidarity that linked the insurrectional projects of enslaved Blacks in the US South with their counterparts on the island of Cuba, a land then under the colonial control of the Spanish Empire. Some decades later, Ann Petrie's novel Tituba of Salem Village, published in 1967, takes a close look at the Barbadian background of the title character and her husband John, starting with the moment when the captives learn from their mistress Susanna Endicott that because she was in financial straits, she had had to sell them to a certain Reverend Samuel Parris. Thus, they now belonged to Reverend Perry, who is going to be a minister in the Boston, in Boston, in the Bay Colony. The trip would follow immediately the next day. We get the sense that Barbados meant something to Tituba and her husband, despite their captivity there, which adds depth to the experience awaiting them in New England, where she would end up indicted of sorcery during the Salem witch trials. The 1953 play, The Crucible, by Arthur Miller, had already featured Tituba among his dramatis personae, but Miller does not invest her with her due share of psychological depth. The history of Caribbean errantry in connection with slavery or the quest for freedom goes back several centuries. The historical translocality of Caribbean life, the itinerancy of the Antillean person, straddles many regions within the hemisphere and beyond. Suffice it to mention that the escape routes of runaway slaves from the Danish, French, and English territories of colonial enslavement until the 1990s sought refuge in the Spanish colonial domains quite often, creating a long pattern of what Professor Carnegie calls transfrontier marronage throughout the region. Practically all slaves in South Carolina during the 17th century and nearly 20% of the enslaved population throughout the 18th century came from the Caribbean and in particular from Barbados. Beginning in the early 1900s, the cultural and intellectual presence of people of Caribbean and Latin American descent in the made itself felt in the United States through the political stances of figures such as Marcus Garvey from Jamaica and his associates. His associates included the likes of Dominican Lieutenant Carlos Cooks, a man from Samana Bay in the Dominican Republic, who contributed much energy and vision to the militant awakening that would subsequently evolve into a full-fledged Black liberation movement. He, in fact, was the last, basically, the last warrior standing, holding aloft the banner of Garveyism. Winston James' seminal study of the impact of Caribbean radicalism on the political agendas of the African American population in the first third of the 20th century proves instructive in this regard. He surveys the legacies of Virgin Islander Hubert Harrison, known as the father of Harlem radicalism, Jamaican Wilfred Domingo, Barbadian Richard B. Moore, Surinamese from Dutch Guyana, then was called then Otto Huiswood, as well as Trinidadian George Padmore, the Pan-Africanist who became known worldwide, as well as Stokely Carmichael, the Black Power movement leader. Pointing to the majority consciousness they brought from their native lands, along with their previous migrations, distrust of church authority, organizational experience, and memory of labor struggles, James does a sound job of contextualizing the radicalism of these Caribbean migrants historically in their particular kind of political background, and he undertakes, as he shows the extent to which they contributed to sort of infusing energy, ideological energy, to the Black movement in the U.S. He also undertakes a persuasive refutation of the anti-Caribbean message in the famous volume, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, the 1967 essay by Harold Cruz, who caustically charges West Indian migrants with insufficient solidarity toward the cause of their African American brethren. Caribbean writers, thinkers, and scholars also played a key role in igniting the cultural revival known as the Harlem Renaissance. The names of Jamaican poet and then fiction writer and then memoirist Claude McKay, Guyanese fiction writer Eric Warrand, and third in this case, only three I'm mentioning. Last in this case, but certainly not least, the bibliophile revolutionary Arturo Schomburg, whose name, of course, will sound familiar. There are many other names, and I'll skip to these because I know we are much aware of our time constraints, and I like us to save some moments for Q&A. But the presence of West Indian migrants in that crucial political and cultural moment in American history belongs in a larger narrative of the long history of Caribbean and Latin American migration, mobility, intra-regional, movements and flows of out-migration. The process has been such that in our own time, nearly 5.5 million people left the Caribbean and the surrounding areas from 1950 to 1989 alone. Glancing over the past 500 years, demographer Aaron Siegel noted years ago that the Caribbean region has borne the deepest and most continuous impact from international migration of any region in the world. And I could spend some time naming famous African Americans who have their Caribbean or Latino background. Sidney Poitier, James Weldon Johnson. Where would the Harlem Renaissance be without him? And so on. Shirley Chisholm, the first African American congresswoman and the first Black woman to run for president, whose parents came from Barbados and British Guyana. And of course, let us not forget Malcolm X himself. We can even go back to the colonial moment and find Jean-Baptiste Poitou-Sable, founder of Chicago, who was born in Haiti. Harry Belafonte, calypso artists, and so on and so forth. And I just mentioned three other names. Marcus, we know Marcus Garvey, but Mrs. Garvey actually was crucial in introducing a taste for Caribbean comedy and for calypso in New York. Yeah, and so that's basically I'll stop there so that the time would allow me. Why am I producing an echo? Is it myself? Okay. Okay. Uh, so so the history of Caribbean uh, errantry, and when I say I'm focusing on the Caribbean, which includes that uh, Hispanophone side, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the Caribbean coast of many Latin American countries. Yeah, with a focus on the Caribbean because it's easier to sort of track from my data. But there's that historical translocality of immigrant life, yeah, the itinerancy of that person, of the Caribbean person, is fundamental to understand basically the ways in which the African American experience has evolved in the 20th century. There are areas of difficulty, yeah, which can be framed in. I'll try to frame it in as careful a set of terms as I can. Areas of difficulty which have to do with a certain U.S. centric kind of emphasis that somehow demands of blacks from other places to perform their blackness in in terms that are prescribed by the U.S. African American experience. And I will here note the difficulty, for instance, that Schomburg encountered. Schomburg came to the United States in 1891 as an adult, and he came actually to advance the cause of the independence movement of Cuba and Puerto Rico from the Spanish Empire. Yeah? When 1898 happened, and the United States basically took the Cuban independence movement, away from the original insurrectionists, and basically turned it into an inter-imperial war. Yeah. Then it was clear that he had to. It was clear to Arturo Schomburg that he had to put his energies elsewhere, and he put it into basically fortifying the black struggle with a focus on culture, knowledge production, and recovery of the great heritage, of the great African heritage of the entire hemisphere. However, much as he contributed to the Harlem Renaissance and that center that we have in New York, the Schomburg Center, he still ended up basically delinking from his original colleagues in the Harlem Renaissance because he felt that he could not sell the notion that it was important to look at the African experience in Latin America. And so basically, he became an Afro-Latino after having been a full-fledged black. Yeah, and so basically, his last years he spends basically trying to produce knowledge that would instruct African Americans about their brethren on the other side of the hemisphere. And and I'll just close by saying that because African Americans are so centered in the United in this kind of U.S. I mean, it is possible to actually, it is possible to speculate about a certain um, U.S. essentialism, or a certain U.S. centric um, exceptionalism that that everybody in the United States, even minorities, inherit from the Anglo tradition, yeah, and that they apply to their co-ethnics elsewhere. Carlos Moore, for instance, who came to from Cuba, uh, basically became African American by learning. He was black there, but he became black in the United States once he was instructed by Maya Angelou how to be black. And he tells the story. Yes, and he tells. Thank you. And so in closing, he tells the story in his autobiography, Pichon. And finally, the United States, people looking at race in the Dominican Republic cannot understand it because they are always looking at it as a case that represents a direct contrast to Haiti. And they do not see that there is no such contrast, and that there is as much Negrophobia in Haiti as there is Hispanophilia in the Dominican Republic. So that picture that Henry Louis Gates presents at the beginning of his Black in Latin America project is simply incomplete. I'll open up whenever the occasion comes for us to have a conversation about any question I may have triggered. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Silvio Torres-Saillant. Now we'll hear from Professor Dagmawi Woubshet.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate in this landmark symposium, Making African America. It's a pleasure, particularly to be on this panel with both dear friends and also scholars I've admired from afar. Also a pleasure to join you from afar, from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, where it's approaching midnight. I was going to say good afternoon, but I'll say good night or good day. My connection is a bit spotty, so I apologize in advance. You may not see me, but I hope you can hear me clearly. The title of my brief presentation is The Question of Diaspora, the Ethics of Blackness and Ethiopian Perspective. One of the major developments in recent Ethiopian history is indeed the birth of a sizable Ethiopian diaspora. Ethiopians began to leave their country en masse in the wake of the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974 and continue to do so today and have been dispersed all over the world, from the United States to the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia to South Africa. How Ethiopians living outside of their native country contend with new national identities and cultures, and more broadly, the new experience of diaspora, of longing and belonging, of homeland and homelessness that all diaspora people contend with, is a topic that demands our critical attention, and one that Ethiopian studies in particular and Africana studies in general have to take up in substantive manner. One can argue, perhaps with a dose of exaggeration, but not that much, that no other experience has altered contemporary Ethiopian life more so than that of diaspora. For one, and to get to the most obvious point, out of the way, today's Ethiopian diaspora, today's Ethiopia cannot economically survive, even thrive. Can you all hear me? Yes, okay. Today's Ethiopian cannot economically survive, even thrive, without millions in remittances that flow back each year and fiscally shore up what remains a poor country. Unlike any other time in its long history, Ethiopia's economic welfare is now tethered to its nationals living abroad. And maybe not as significant, but nonetheless important, is also the role Ethiopians living abroad have played in shaping Ethiopian politics since the 1970s. The Ethiopian student movement, which was so crucial in undoing imperial power and ideology, brought down the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie, for instance, flourished through its international affiliates, like the Ethiopian Student Union in North America. Subsequently, both the Derg communist regime and what succeeded it, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, have faced fierce opposition from abroad, particularly in the United States, as exiled Ethiopians in America sought to mount viable opposition against these regimes and exert political pressure by using various media platforms. For example, I think of the role of Voice of America during the Derg years in the late 70s and 80s, censored in Ethiopia at the time, to ISAT, Ethiopian Satellite Television, headquartered in Washington, D.C., which has also been intermittently censored under EPRDF rule. Even today, the short reign of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed draws enormous support and growing and fierce opposition from Ethiopians scattered all over the US. In short, at the very least, different political organizations and alternate media infrastructure in the diaspora have played an important role in providing counter-narratives and critiques of formal political power in Ethiopia over the last 50 years. But I'm not an economist nor a political scientist, so I'll leave it to colleagues in those fields to weigh the economic and political significance of the Ethiopian diaspora in shaping its contemporary history. I raise these points simply to signal the ways in which diaspora structurally undergirds contemporary Ethiopian life. Now, coming to my own field of expertise, then let me address the cultural significance of diaspora in the making of Ethiopian identity at home and abroad, particularly the US. When you arrive at Addis Ababa Bole International Airport, ask someone, anyone, from the customs agent issuing you entry visa to the bank teller changing dollars or euros to birr, from the airport security to the luggage handler, ask them, what does the word diaspora mean? And each one will be quick to give you an answer. In the last 3 decades, no other foreign word has found everyday currency in Ethiopia more so than diaspora. In the Ethiopian context, diaspora refers to, on the one hand, immigrant Ethiopians who have settled abroad, and on the other, returnees who've come back home either for short holiday visits or for good, like what we call Tekaloya Metta, those who've packed up and returned to resettle in their country of birth. Also, depending on tone, diaspora could be a descriptive term or a pejorative term. So you can say, so-and-so's diaspora, or you can say, ugh, he's diaspora, meaning they've come back from abroad and are putting on posture. So you have to heed the tone of how someone pronounces that word. Now, unlike the conventional meaning of the word diaspora, which signals a people's physical dispersal or movement away from homeland, Ethiopians use the term to indicate both a movement away from and back to one's homeland, indeed confounding the term's unidirectional logic of departure without return. This local usage of diaspora is certainly counterintuitive to the established definition of the term, including the way we critically apply it in the field of African American studies. In general, when we speak of the African diaspora, implied is a clear place of origin, that is Africa, and of dispersal, chiefly, the Western Atlantic world, that the descendants of the Middle Passage have made their home. As a critical term then, diaspora has come to signify the historical conditions and the set of cultural practices that constitute modern Black life outside of Africa, from majority Black countries like Brazil and Jamaica to minority ones like the United States and Mexico. But rarely do we apply the term to characterize Black experience within the continent until now, given our contemporary historical condition of large numbers of Africans living abroad, whose immediate familial and cultural ties to the continent remains unbroken, including the possibility of return to one's native land, which was something inconceivable to previous generation of diaspora Africans who crossed the Atlantic under conditions of chattel slavery. To be sure, that people of African descent have returned back to Africa is not a new phenomenon. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, repatriated ex-slaves and free Black people established Sierra Leone and Liberia. Following World War II, Rastafarians from the Caribbean repatriated to the town of Shashamene in Ethiopia, where Emperor Haile Selassie had granted 500 acres of land to show his gratitude to Black people in the Americas who came to fight alongside Ethiopia during the fascist invasion. And from its independence onward, Ghana has proved a continental alternative for a number of African diasporans, particularly African American expatriates seeking home, most notably the towering African American intellectual and Pan-Africanist of his generation, W.B. Du Bois, and most recently, the incomparable musician, songwriter, artist Stevie Wonder, who announced a month ago his plans to repatriate to Ghana. So the repatriation and expatriation of people of African descent back to the continent is not unprecedented. Still, the conceptual terms of Black movement at our disposal, diaspora, repatriation, and expatriation, for instance, do not fully account for the particular way the physical movement of contemporary Africans is redefining not only the theoretical parameters of a term like diaspora, but also the material and cultural conditions of both countries of departure and arrival. The term diaspora's counter-conventional meaning in Ethiopia, diaspora as both an experience of departure and one of return, provides, I believe, one important vantage point for understanding how the new Ethiopian and more broadly, the new African presence around the world, especially in the United States, demands us to come up with new, critical conceptual terms to better guide our studies of the contemporary, including today's African America. Allow me to narrow my focus and consider the experience of Ethiopians in the United States. Since the US is the largest diaspora population of Ethiopians, in the last few decades, moreover, since the US has replaced former colonial powers like France and England as the country of choice for Africans to make a new beginning. Sometimes called the new African Americans or American Africans, or what the Nigerian American novelist Chimamanda Adichie calls non-American Blacks, more Africans have come to the US since 1965 than through the Middle Passage, and their experience is finally gaining the creative and critical attention it merits. And when you look at several American cities today, the African presence is so palpable that today's Minneapolis would be unthinkable without Somalis, Houston without Nigerians, Harlem without a Senegalese, Washington, D.C. and the DMV without Ethiopians. For instance, inconceivable today to think about food culture and cuisine in D.C. and the DMV, for instance, without Ethiopian food. A study of African immigrants in the US entails a critical look at how they contend with what it means to be Black in contemporary America. When it comes to theorizing race and immigration in the US, we now have a robust body of scholarship on how European immigrants became white in America. As James Baldwin succinctly puts it, the price of the ticket was to cease being Irish, cease being Greek, cease being Russian, cease being whatever you had been before to become white. And that is why this country says it's a white country and really believes it. Unquote. The history of European immigration to the US entailed a twofold disavowal. On the one hand, the erasure of one's identity of origin in order to become white and therefore American, and on the other, the repudiation and oppression of America's Black population against which white Americanness draws legitimacy and legibility. If this twofold process of disavowal is the means by which Europeans become white American, then by what mechanism does the new African immigrant become Black American? Is disavowal also constitutive of the new African immigrant as it is for the European? Given that Americanness is predicated on race, how do we theorize the process by which an Ethiopian, a Nigerian, a Sudanese, a Kenyan, or a Somali becomes categorically Black in America? Racial classification is so fundamental to American society. Whether it's white American identity that's idealized or a Black one that's maligned, Americanness is defined by racial categorization nonetheless. To be American, in short, is to be a racialized subject. One has to be legible as a raced person in order to be legally and culturally legible as an American. All immigrants discover this soon, right? This is a foreign concept for so many immigrants coming from African countries where racial classification isn't an organizing feature of the nation state. So we have to think carefully through the process of racialization that African immigrants also contend with, right, as part of the naturalization and assimilation process. So how does the African immigrant become a Black American? Since the race rules of America differ markedly from those of the diverse countries of the African continent, we cannot presume race to be a constant, all right, across place nor racial identification a given. Hence, we have to weigh how all Black immigrants have to undergo the process of becoming Black according to American racial norms. Hence, Black immigrants face a particular dilemma, since they're forced to identify with the disesteemed of the country. And so much hinges on how we accept that identification as a burden or a boon. It doesn't matter where immigrants arrive from, Afghanistan or Angola, Mozambique or Myanmar, Serbia or Sudan. They know who is at the bottom of American society, and all immigrants, including those who are Black, quote unquote Black, try to distinguish themselves from the population in a category so freighted with negative meaning. Immigrants who come to America to improve their station in life, in other words, do not want upon arrival to be placed at the margins, but it is precisely the people at the margins who have paved the way for Black immigrants to find not only entry into the country, but also the possibility of a meaningful life exiled from home. Whoever appreciates that fact begins to see Black not as a category of disesteem, but the very category that has made America a reality and a possibility around which still coalesce the best ideals of the modern world. So one meaningful way of becoming Black for the African immigrant is to conceive of race not as an essential or prescriptive category, which applies to him by virtue of being African and phenotypically Black, and by virtue of being in America, but rather to think of race as an ethical category that continues to underwrite modernity's virtues. If James Baldwin is right, that, quote, white is absolutely a moral choice for there are no white people, unquote, then we have to consider too how we might conceive of Black as a moral choice with its own set of principles, acts, and feelings. Let me conclude then. So I'm not naive. To accept Blackness automatically as an ethical boon can be a tall order, since African immigrants, like others in the world enthralled by Hollywood, have fattened, or is it starved, our imagination with Black stereotype and anti-African American sentiment. And in the same way that Black Americans have come to see Africa mainly through Hollywood's eyes, Africans' pictures of Black Americans have been filmed through the same racist gaze. Not only that, leaving an all-Black country and coming to a majority white one, Black immigrants are forced to contend with that peculiar sensation Du Bois so aptly defined over a century ago as double consciousness. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others or measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, unquote. African immigrants begin to realize, or must realize, if they are to survive America, that the gaze with which they hold Black Americans upon arrival is the same one through which white America will view them in the new country. And either they have to liberate their gaze and begin to see African Americans without white contempt and pity, or internalize those feelings and begin to see themselves according to standards inimical to their psychic welfare. Thus, as new Americans, how we forge an identity imbued with ethical and political meaning, that is, how we choose to be Black, is a timely question, a question we can begin to broach, as briefly sketched here, using our experience of the new African diaspora and the radical ethical traditions African Americans have honed over the last 4 centuries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dagmawi. Our next presenter is Mukoma wa Ngugi. Mukoma?
Hello? I would like to add my thanks to Professor Julie Green, Kate Keene, University of Maryland, and the National Museum of African American History and Culture for this fantastic symposium. My talk today is about the interactions between African Americans and Jamaicans during the 20th century. And I have some anecdotes revealing these interactions I'd like to share with you in just a moment. And my anecdotes all share a few things in common. First, they reveal connections between African Americans and Jamaicans, like I said. Second, they reveal, or they revolve around individuals with histories of international migration. Third, they have something to do with sharing music. And finally, and relatedly, these migrations and interactions in most cases led to new kinds of music being formed. Finding these connections has been the easy part. The more difficult part for me has been thinking about the significance of these movements and interactions. So let me start with some anecdotes, and they're really just individual stories of people. Then I'll finish with what I consider the significance of the stories. Because I can't show images here, I created a tweet thread on Twitter for anyone who would like some visual information related to my discussion. On the tweet thread, you can also find a list of recommended music. So please check out my pinned thread at my Twitter handle, Jason P. McGraw, just JASON PMCGRAW. So my first anecdote or historical figure is singer, actor, civil rights activist, and global icon Harry Belafonte. I'm starting with Belafonte because his life and art reveal important connections between African American and Jamaican music. And in fact, Belafonte himself is a connector to and between my subsequent anecdotes. So Harry Belafonte was born in New York City in 1927 to Jamaican immigrants. He grew up in New York, but he also spent time in his parents' homeland of Jamaica as a child. So Belafonte moved back and forth between the US and Jamaica in his childhood, and he really had a transnational childhood in the 1930s. So Jamaica offered Belafonte at least two things. One was Black pride. So in fact, Belafonte's mother was a follower of Marcus Garvey, the Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist leader from Jamaica. Second, Jamaica offered Belafonte a love for music. He witnessed there how music animated daily life for many people he met. So Jamaica was Belafonte's first musical education, and it was his first political education. And he writes about this in his memoir, if you're interested in learning more about that. So Belafonte came to the world's attention in the Calypso craze as a singer, and he was at the center of the Calypso craze in the 1950s. Calypso music is originally from Trinidad, but the craze of the 1950s was a North American creation. And in fact, this is where Belafonte's story connects with my next historical figure, my next anecdote. And that person is Jamaican Louise Bennett. If you created a list of top 10 most significant influential Jamaicans of the 20th century, Louise Bennett would be on your list. Bennett was a folklorist, storyteller, theater producer, writer, author, singer, and cultural activist. She shaped more aspects of Jamaican national culture than any other individual. In particular, through her art and activism, Bennett helped legitimize Jamaican, sometimes called patois, the spoken tongue and the nation language of the Jamaican people. Louise Bennett was also a migrant. Like many educated Jamaicans, she made her way to London in the 1950s to further her studies. While in London, she worked for the BBC on the Caribbean service. And while in London as well, she recorded Jamaican songs. And these songs from the early 1950s are some of the earliest recorded commercial Jamaican songs ever made. But in 1954, Bennett moved to New York City. So Bennett belonged to Jamaica's cultural and educated elite, but she shared with working class Jamaicans a history of multiple migrations, like Harry Belafonte and Belafonte's parents. Bennett settled in Harlem, and she joined the local literati. She befriended Langston Hughes, and Shirley Graham Du Bois. Shirley Graham Du Bois, the writer, musician, activist, and later the wife of W.E.B. Du Bois. And while in New York City, Bennett also sang in public Jamaican songs at the Village Vanguard in Greenwich Village. At the Vanguard, she performed with Irving Burgee. Burgee is also known by his calypsonian name, Lord Burgess. At the time the two performed together at the Village Vanguard, Burgee had just been hired to write songs for Harry Belafonte. Several of Burgee's compositions would go on to Belafonte's Calypso album from 1956. This is the first LP to sell more than 1 million copies. This was the beginning of the Calypso craze of the mid-1950s. Burgee learned several songs from Louise Bennett, songs that became some of Belafonte's most iconic, like Day-O, better known as the Banana Boat song, and Jamaica Farewell. Jamaica Farewell is a radical remake of the traditional Jamaican song Iron Bar. Although Burgee downplays Bennett's role in his autobiography, Belafonte remembered Louise Bennett as, quote, our well of knowledge. The Calypso craze on the whole was a Jamaican African-American cultural production. Like I said, Calypso music hails from Trinidad, but the craze of the 1950s had only slight input from Trinidadians. Obviously, the US mass culture and white-controlled record labels, film studios, and television stations made it into the craze. But despite that, it was the very local level interactions and borrowings between Jamaicans and African Americans that were at the root of the craze. Much of Jamaicans' musical knowledge was filtered through interactions with Black American artists like Burgee and Belafonte. Louise Bennett was just starting out in her career when she made this incredible, if mostly hidden, impact on US mass culture. There were more moments of back and forth across borders in the Calypso craze, because eventually it reached back to Jamaica itself. Once in Jamaica, the global craze reshaped local music. So Jamaican folk music was called mento, but it was repackaged as Calypso, even though the music called Calypso in the US was really often mento. For instance, Lord Flea, a Jamaican mento singer, rebranded himself as a Calypsonian in order to cash in on the craze. And then later on, nationalism took hold, and Jamaicans went back to calling their music mento. The historical figures of my next anecdote are Veer and Lillian Johns. Veer Johns was born in the 1890s, and in the 1920s, he immigrated to New York City around the same time that Harry Belafonte's parents made the same journey. This is really the hidden Great Migration. As hundreds of thousands of African Americans left the US South and headed to northern cities, they were joined by tens of thousands of Caribbean migrants. This story is only sometimes acknowledged despite its impact on US cultural history. In New York, Veer Johns wrote for newspapers, he acted on the stage, he hosted a jazz and blues radio show, and he met and married Lillian May, an African-American actor, singer, and dancer from Brooklyn. Together, they immersed themselves in the jazz age. They drank with Cab Calloway in Lenox Avenue speakeasies, and they listened to Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong in local clubs. Then in the 1930s, Veer and Lillian Johns moved to Jamaica. This was in the same years that young Harry Belafonte was moving there too. The Johns hoped to instill a bit of the Harlem Renaissance in the island. And their main venture for this was called Opportunity Hour, which they explicitly modeled after Amateur Night at the Apollo Theater. Lillian Johns was the real force behind Opportunity Hour. She rehearsed contestants, she conducted the band during the shows, and she even performed on stage herself. Between 1939 and 1966, thousands of Jamaicans competed in the Opportunity Hour shows. But the Johns did more than just recreate Amateur Night at the Apollo in Jamaica. They also helped institutionalize rhythm and blues. As consumers of African-American music, Jamaicans needed no help. Since the 1920s, Jamaicans had embraced the blues and jazz, buying music, dancing to American music. But in the 1950s, Opportunity Hour validated youth performance of rhythm and blues, doo-wop, and rock and roll. And Jamaica became an outpost of Black American music, not just as consumers, but as producers. So if you're a fan of ska or reggae music from back in the day, then I guarantee you that your favorite artist performed at Opportunity Hour. So Laurel Aitken, Derek Harriott, John Holt, Millie Small, Delroy Wilson, Jimmy Cliff, and Bob Marley were just a few of the singers who auditioned in front of US-born Lillian Johns. Opportunity Hour became an incubator for the Jamaican music industry. So this is a story that Jamaicans know and scholars of Jamaican music know, but few elsewhere are likely to have heard of it. African-American music saturated Jamaica in the 1950s and 60s. So if you're interested, I suggest some Jamaican doo-wop in my tweet thread. And if you don't look at the credits, you would think you were listening to a group right off the street corner of Philadelphia circa 1958. There are at least two other hidden stories here with the Johns. The first is the first hidden story here is African-American migration to Jamaica. So since the age of Garvey, dozens and perhaps hundreds of African-Americans made Jamaica their home. Many played important roles in local life there. The second hidden story here is about hundreds, if not thousands, of marriages between African-Americans and Jamaicans. So I want to say more about that in just a second. So my final anecdote is more well-known. Clive Campbell migrated from Jamaica to the Bronx in 1967. In the Bronx, which had a growing Jamaican population, Campbell took the name DJ Kool Herc, built his own sound system. This is a story that is well known. This becomes the basis for hip hop coming out of the Bronx in the 1970s. So I'm out of time, but Kool Herc basically reinvented Jamaican musical practices in the Bronx. I know I'm out of time, but I want to mention my significance here. Harry Belafonte mentions in his memoir that his parents were undocumented immigrants to the US, and this caused a great deal of stress in their lives. And this makes me think about there are over 500,000 undocumented Black immigrants, Black people in the US today. So as we listen to our favorite music, we should think about how some of this has been made by undocumented Black people. 21 Savage, who was caught by ICE in 2019. Daniel Dumile, better known as MF Doom, who was denied re-entry into the US in 2010 because he was undocumented. So we should think about undocumented Black people and how significant they've been to the music that we enjoy, even though we haven't appreciated their own lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Mukoma wa Ngugi.
Yeah, I guess I did mute myself, so now you missed my opening joke. But in the interest of time, no, in the interest of time, I cannot repeat my joke. Yeah, no, but so I was thinking in terms of Jason's presentation, and just yesterday I began my class with playing Harry Belafonte. I've decided to begin every class for my African and African American course. To begin with music. So just yesterday we played Harry Belafonte and Miriam Makeba, where they sing the song Malaika, right? So now we talked a little bit about the trajectory of having a Jamaican American, South African anti-apartheid activist, right? All of them getting together through a different language, which both of them don't speak. Sorry, starting my timer. Yeah, so for me, there's a certain fluidity that I admire when it comes to musicians, right? When you think about Malian blues, You always have, musicians just getting their guitar and going to chill with Malian blues musicians and just jamming. I have a novel coming out in May. I'm very outdated with song, which talks about Ethiopian blues. So I'm sorry I couldn't hear Dagmawi's presentation, because I don't know if you talk about the Zita, right? Zita and James Baldwin, his essay. It's a brilliant essay on how the Zita, this form of Ethiopian blues, are in conversation with James Baldwin, and consequently African American blues and music and so on and so forth. So yeah, and also my novel Nairobi Hit, that deals with the questions of Africans and African Americans, and where the main detective is African American who goes to Kenya to investigate a murder case. So these are questions that are always on my mind. But in preparing for today, I was thinking of what really animates my interest in the question of the relationship between Africans and African Americans. And for myself, I go back to living in New Jersey. So I was born in Evanston, Illinois, right? I was born in Evanston, Illinois 50 years ago. But I grew up in Kenya. Then I came back in 1990 for college, right? And I remember my first cake party, right? A cake party, hanging out, blah, 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 having fun. And a fellow African-American first-year student comes up to me and asks, do Africans live on trees, right? Do we live on trees? And so you could actually say since 1990, I've been trying to understand the response I had and where the question came from, right? Because, of course, we meet racism every day. Racism is not everything. There's nothing about racism. But there was something so hurtful about that question that you could argue overreacted, and I guess so did he, because we almost came to blows. But at some point, an older student came up to us who was Black as well. She came up to us and she said, "Look, you don't understand. You're acting out history." That was my takeaway point. You don't understand what you're doing. It's almost as if you're acting out how racism wants you to act. So since then, I've been thinking about the idea of how Africans and African Americans see themselves through the lens of racism, right? Or in the class I teach, where it begins with the question of in the syllabus, it begins with the question of what happens when two peoples who have double consciousnesses meet, right? So in the case of the African, of course, colonialism and and inferiority complexes that come with that, right? So at the same time, the double consciousness, of course, from Du Bois, talking about African Americans, right? So what happens? I'm always interested in that meeting. So what happens when here I am, I'm 19, first year in college. Here's the other guy, he's 19, first year in college, and we just meet. And within just minutes of interaction, well, we're almost coming to blows, right? So in the course of trying to answer that question of why I do chilling by a keg would fight with an African American in a ways I wouldn't have fought a racist, it's been an interesting journey. And the one question that I think truly needs to be addressed between Africans and African Americans, even the questions of immigration. I mean, now you do have the question of Eugene Robinson writing the book Disintegration, showing that different types of blackness in the U.S. Right. But before we even talk about solidarity, before we talk about all these questions that are so pressing to us, as scholars and also as living human beings, it's a question of who sold who, right? The question of slavery. Did Africans participate in slavery? To what extent were they African? You know what I mean? Like, to what extent were they Africans who are saying, "Okay, I'm getting you my black brother or sister, and I'm selling this slavery"? To what extent did they see themselves as different nations? But at the heart of the questions of Africans and African Americans, there is a question that needs to be talked about. So, in the course of my own trying to answer that question, one of the books I teach is Maya Angelou's All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes. And in that book, she talks about going to Keta in Ghana, right? She spent some time in Ghana. She spent some time in Ghana, a number of years in Ghana, right? Where, W. Du Bois was there, Malcolm X at some point came to visit, and we can talk about the solidarities, the political solidarities that were in place and happening, starting from the beginning of slavery. Right? But anyway, she talks about going to this little village called Keta. Keta to me has become a metaphor, and I'll tell you why shortly. So she gets there, and she finds this melancholic, that's where she describes it, this melancholic town where slaves were being taken from, right? And when she gets there, I don't know, in the interest of time, I won't get into the whole spiel, but when she gets there, she finds a town that is still suffering from generations and generations, generations after generation, of the trauma of having been the town that was getting sacked, right, where the slaves were being taken from. So I visited Keta, and this is part of the difficulty of what I'm trying to write now, right? I visited Keta, and it is truly the same. So Maya Angelou was writing about it in the 1950s and 1960s, and there I was 2 years ago. It is a town where the melancholy is palpable, right? Because after all, in the same way you can inherit wealth, in the same way you can inherit wealth and so on and so forth, so can you inherit trauma? So I don't know, I've never seen a town before where you could say that even the way the people move, first it wasn't about Okay, so can you hear me now? Yes, so sorry about my internet connection. But anyway, but the point about Keta is then it's a town where slaves were being taken from, where they were being taken from, right? So meaning that the question of who sells who sold who, can be easily addressed. Okay, maybe not easily, really. Maybe not easily, but it can be. We can also talk about mutual losses as well, right? Okay, so I raise this point because it's salient, right? And you have the late Ali Mazrui and Henry Louis Gates going back and forth about the question of slavery, right? But how come we don't talk about the losses, epigenetic, that we have inherited over the years, over generations of slaves, or people who are getting raided. Shortly after I left Keta, I went to Bristol in London. Sorry, checking the time. Okay, Bristol was a slave trading town. You might know it now because of what's his name? Carlson. Yeah, Carlson. Yeah, who was a major slave trader. His statue got taken down, and they put a BLM activist, and in place of that statue. But it really was a way of seeing, okay, on the one hand, you have Keta that has been devastated, generations. On the other hand, to see Bristol, where for generations they've been benefiting from the same wealth that was taken away, right? So I do feel, as much as we can talk about the solidarities, and I also want to take a moment to talk about the hidden histories that Africans and African Americans don't know of each other, right? So in my own example, that was very, actually painful, very painful, was the realization, and painful because as a scholar who works on decoloniality and blah, 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 right? So was the realization that Malcolm X had come to Kenya, actually twice, Zanzibar and also Tanzania. And this is not common knowledge, right? We don't grow up knowing that Malcolm X came to Kenya. We don't grow up knowing that, that Malcolm X, went to Ghana and other places, right? But the fact that he came to Kenya, he gave a speech at the parliament, met with Pio Gama Pinto, who was a trade unionist, radical. right? But the fact that Malcolm X was in Kenya, and this is not something we grow up applauding. There isn't even a plaque that says Malcolm X was here, right? It does begin to show how, to my mind, in a very visceral way, to the extent to which our histories are hidden from each other, right? So, of course, then to add to that, then I didn't grow up reading about African-American history. I don't remember reading about Malcolm X or Martin Luther King or the civil rights in 1980s, 1990s Kenya. And the same thing in the US. Like, I don't think African-Americans grow up learning about these histories as well, right? So, but anyway, to end, there are several issues here, right? One is a history of political solidarity, right? A history of political solidarity that then, this is where then you talk about Malcolm X coming to the OAU and trying to bring the US in front of the United Nations for human rights abuses, right? The solidarity of Du Bois, eventually dying in Ghana, but his Pan-Africanism, double consciousness, and so on and so forth. The solidarity of that leads Mandela to eventually come to the US and saying, look, without the involvement of African Americans in the African liberation struggles, right? It would have taken a long time to free South Africa. So there's that political solidarity is there and it's not known. So my question has been then, how is our not knowing really? How is our not knowing being used actually against Africans and African Americans, right? So consider this, right? Okay, so in Ethiopia, in Washington D.C., there is the Little Addis now, right? I guess a part of the town that's called Little Addis, but it was at the expense of. And I want to be careful here, right? But it says it was an expense of essentially the Ethiopians in Little Addis gentrifying an area that was primarily African American, right? At some point, there was even an argument about renaming a street, right? Renaming a street from an African American name to an Ethiopian name, and so on and so forth, right? At the same time, in New Jersey, I mentioned earlier, there used to be fights between Africans and African Americans and struggles and so on and so forth. So how do we reconcile this history of solidarity, political solidarity, and so on and so forth? Beautiful, very beautiful and complex, I should add, solidarity. And at the same time, how do we reconcile the day-to-day tensions? One last thing, then I'll be quiet. All right, so, and then going back to Silvio's presentation, right? Like, to what extent do we talk about the Cuban involvement, right? The Cuban involvement in Angola, or Che Guevara in the Congo, but to what extent do we talk about Afro-Cubans and the involvement in the struggles in Angola and elsewhere historically? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mukoma. So we have time probably for one question, and it's for the entire panel. Each of you talked about the complexity of the exchanges, that there's no such thing as a unidirectional flow. Could you discuss the back and forthness of African diasporic cultural production? That was a question from the audience for the entire panel.
So sorry, I know my connection isn't that good, so I missed the beginning of the question.
The question from the audience for the entire panel is, could you talk about the back and forthness of African diasporic cultural production?
So, okay, since I guess I didn't hear the first part of the question, I should go first. But okay, so I think to my mind, you can take it in different levels, right? That question, right? One is political, it's sort of political solidarity I talked about, right? Where You have Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. There's this really beautiful scene in Maya Angelou's All God's Children, The New Traveling Shoes, where she's describing Malcolm X has come to Ghana, just made his case from Nkrumah. Nkrumah at that point is trying to, to bring African Americans into Ghana. And Malcolm X is leaving, but he gets escorted, spontaneously though, escorted by ambassadors from Cuba, from, I don't know, Angola, from different global South satellites, right? And there is that, yep. So there's a political solidarity. There's a literary solidarity as well, right? And cultural, if you think about rap and so on and so forth. If you think about blues, I mentioned Zita at the beginning, right? But you can talk about Malian blues, Zita, then rap and so on and so forth. What I do think, though, that we need to really think about is also the things that divide us, right? The things we cannot take for granted, and how African immigrants in the US, first generation, second generation, and so on and so forth, are being used as a buffer between whites or whiteness and Black Americans. So we become the model minority, as they used to say, of Asian Americans. Right? So the African